the Big Bit Podcast, the show that features conversation that involve you, inspire you, and impact you. I'm your host, Dipanshu Sharma, and today we'll be talking about the science of well-being with our guest, Dr. Nick Holton. He's a PhD in educational psychology, a co-director of positive education at Shipley School, Pennsylvania, USA, and also a peak performance coach. In today's high competition and high stress levels life, we all look out for tools to stay on top of our games. Dr. Nick Holton, who's worked with NBA athletes and many other top performers, will be talking about how to create a life full of purpose, passion, fulfillment, and motivation. So stay sure and stay with us until the end.
All right. Good morning, Nick. How are you this morning?
Good evening. Thank you. I'm doing well, thanks. How about you?
I'm great. This time difference got me for a little bit, especially the whole what is it that you guys have there? The whole
daylight savings.
Daylight saving. There you go. I never get used to it. Even my time in the U.S., I struggle with so much.
No, nobody does. In fact, the research community is pretty intense about sending out kind of some of the stats on how that 1 hour change can kind of screw up a variety of different things: performance, health, sleep, whatever it might be. So I think there's a growing consensus to get rid of it in the States.
Can't wait to contribute to it. Nick, congratulations on your new book, by the way, Winning Mindset. I got around to read the chapter that you wrote, and it was amazing, especially the reapproach that you've shined a light upon, and how that has such a big impact, not only on your sports or the area of your productivity, but to live a fulfilled and contentment life. Which brings me to the first issue that I want to address here, and I just kind of want to talk about it, is the fact that we've heard a lot about and talked about the statement where you become a reflection of the average five people you hang out with or you surround yourself with. How do you form a productive circle from an early age, and how does one keep track of that productivity? Can you talk to us a little bit about the group flow state?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple different questions there, like the group flow state being a little different than just sort of the surroundings that kind of help you be your best self. Like the group flow state is something very distinct, and we can get into that, but I'll shelve that just for a second. I think we need to be a little careful here in suggesting that as young people, children, teenagers, even into adolescence, that we're totally in control of who we surround ourselves with. For instance, like I did nothing to be born to, very loving and caring and supportive parents, for instance, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings, whoever it might be. So I'm very privileged in that respect, right? I'm very fortunate. I will say that, as long as I can remember, my parents have always kind of said, maybe through dumb luck, maybe through a sense of intuition, I seem to have chosen or at least landed with really good friends. And I don't mean good just from the standpoint of getting along with them, but people who were kind, who were driven, who looked out for others, right? And myself included, who would be there to support when things went poorly and be there to celebrate when things went well. And so I think just as a young person, and again, even going into adolescence, which, typically ends around age 25. So you've got a lot of young adults who are more or less still kids and, biologically speaking, and in terms of cognitive development, just stopping to say, like, are the people around me, there for help and support when I need it? And are they there to celebrate when good things happen? And vice versa. Do I feel compelled through a sense of belonging and connection to do the same for them? And I think, that seems like a pretty simplistic answer, and it is, but I think that's a pretty good place to start.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. Especially, I love the part where you talked about not necessarily wanting to control it or telling them, okay, these are the boundaries that you should surround type of people with. It's more sort of you go out and explore and see what sticks and what you like in and around your interests, and be it sports, be it any kind of field of interest that one might have.
And I think, I think another key element for anyone to understand is that the quote unquote right people to surround yourself with does not necessarily mean that those people should always make you feel good or always make you feel better. I think they should always be coming from a place, what we would call in the educational world, of sort of like a warm demander. They hold a high standard. They let you know if maybe you've done something wrong, or they don't necessarily absolve you of the unpleasantness that you might be experiencing, be it guilt or shame or sadness or whatever it might be. Because they hold that certain standard, right? They help you kind of become a better version of yourself, but they always do it from a place of love and care and compassion, and overall friendship. I had on to my own podcast, Lydia Dunworth, who's written a wonderful bestseller on friendship, and she's a blogger for Scientific American. And she would say, you know, when it comes to friendship, you really do want pretty much unconditional positive regard, and so that these interactions with a good friend are typically positive, typically pleasant, but I don't know that that means they always absolve you of sort of any wrongdoing, right? I like to think that in fact, I can distinctly remember some of my closest friends, when I have screwed up in the past, it's been sort of the guilt and maybe teetering on shame for what kind of they thought that helped me, I think, grow and learn from that and be a better person and be a little bit more disciplined and thoughtful going forward. So there's that general sort of foundation, I think, of love and compassion, but ultimately it's not that simplistic, right? There's room for sort of the dynamism of psychological range, right? And emotional range in a good relationship.
Love that. Nick, talk to us a little bit about group flow, because we barely touched on it, and I just want my listeners to know, first of all, I don't think everyone is familiar with the concept of flow. It was for me, it was when I came to our community, and you shared the light on us in the workshop that we had with you. So I just want you to give us a little brief on that, so that then we can make it a little bit more specific and get into an healthy.
Sure. Yeah. Let's kind of do this in layers. So I think the first layer is, what is flow? And you're going to see sort of different definitions depending on the researcher or the group you talk to. But I think it's kind of simplest to describe flow in terms of its characteristics, because I think that's what people generally understand and know that they've experienced at some point in their life, right? So flow, exactly. Flow at sort of, different degrees, different levels, is really complete absorption in an experience, right? Now, that can be sort of an achievement-oriented, goal-driven, productive experience. So you might get completely lost. The classic example are video games. Video games are built for flow. You can get lost in them. There's a very clear goal. There's typically a very precise, dialed in, what we call challenge skills ratio. There's complexity, there's unpredictability, there's a lot of psychological drivers of attention and focus, and you can kind of assess this even on a neurochemical level. So the product of that tends to be being one with the experience. There's actually a deactivation of the prefrontal cortex, which results in the distortion of time, right? And the loss of sense of self. So the inner critic shuts down, time passes either really quickly or really slowly. And as a byproduct, a bit of the subconscious becomes more activated, and we tend to perform at a really high level. We might be processing faster, we might be more creative, But that oneness and that loss of sort of the external sense of self, that oneness with the experience, I think oftentimes gets translated as some sort of spiritual or mystical experience as well, right? This connection with something that goes beyond just sort of, meta awareness, so to speak. So you'll see different iterations or different kind of conceptualizations of the flow state, but that kind of runs the gamut. Group flow then is sort of experiencing that state, that phenomena with other people. And this could be in a group, but I think, technically you would define a group as just more than one person, right? So you could have it in just a interpersonal conversation with one other individual. Clients I'll work with, one particular guy stands out, big real estate guy in New York City, and he was struggling to kind of find time to build in what we would call flow blocks, right? Where he could really sit down, intentionally get into this state and produce. And he was struggling to find that time because he had to be on phone calls all the time. Part of his job and his role was very social and very network based. So what we did is we went through kind of different characteristics of group flow, or in this case, flow with pairs, right? And kind of said, okay, how can you more mindfully listen, be more in tune to the conversation, establish sort of a shared purpose, and really immerse yourself into the experience in a way that enhances the conversation, allows you to get lost, makes it more productive, makes it more useful in some way, shape, or form. And that was very transformational for him. He came back a few weeks later during our next session together and said that it had really kind of transformed his day-to-day operation. And I think that can be a fundamental enhancer of relationships as well, because the team is really gelling together in various ways. And we're just starting, I think, to really understand more about group flow. There was just a couple papers that came out of kind of the European flow research group within the last year or so that are actually starting to identify kind of the neurological signatures of group flow. Up to this point, it's been a lot of psychological. Your listeners might be interested if they want to know more. Check out a great book called Group Genius by Keith Sawyer. And that's kind of the foundation of a lot of psychological group flow research, but neuroscience is going to drill down more granular over the next few years, I think.
Yeah, I think this is great stuff, because not only are we talking just about peak performance for athletes, we're kind of touching on every human on earth, and they can experience and not only just enhance their performance, they can be a better functioning human in all segments of their life, actually. And it was funny how when you were just iterating all these great things about flow, what came to my mind was it becomes such a great concept where now it's more understandable why in combat certain groups work better than others, or certain teams work better together to achieve their goal, because they're all zoned into and they tap into that zone we call flow. And I think that might be a bit better way for my listeners to sort of understand that. But it was great. I loved how you put it out there. I want to talk a bit about beliefs. Our beliefs, our habits. How do you evaluate progression of your belief system when your goal is to stay committed to lifelong learning, consistent learning, along with skill acquisition and to attain self-confidence as well?
Well, I think the two are related, but of course, somewhat separate issues. So if you take beliefs and really a collection of beliefs, which is what we'd sort of call a mindset, right? That can lead to certain skill acquisition or not, right? I think if we were to think of it sequentially, which you don't necessarily need to do, but for the simplicity of the model here, let's take sort of one of the most fundamental kind of, dichotomies of beliefs, which is optimism and pessimism. Right. So what's optimism? Optimism, scientifically speaking, is just the general belief that things can or will go well. Right? It's underpins personal growth and skill acquisition, because you would only engage in a behavior, right, logically, if you think you might gain something from it. This is a basic sort of human trait, right? If you are incredibly pessimistic about something, it's going to be increasingly unlikely that you'll actually take the steps forward or engage in that behavior, right? This is slightly different than hope. For instance, hope, scientifically speaking, is more specific to a goal or target. Hope breaks down into two fundamental components, which is what we call agency and pathways. So pathways is like, do I have strategies? Do I see tangible steps to take to make this thing happen that I hope will happen? But agency really speaks to that belief piece that you brought up, right? Do I believe that I have the skill and the motivation necessary, and can I sustain that motivation over the course of time to make this thing happen? And in order to have that, you have to be somewhat optimistic. This is similar conceptually to a term which I talk about in my book chapter, like self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our belief in our own ability to accomplish a task or take on a challenge. And it tends to be predicted by a few different things, which of course ties in to that overall notion of we, not just me, right? So how do we build up this optimism? How do we build up self-efficacy and confidence in our ability to have a go and to take things on? Well, one of the primary sources is having a go, taking things on, and being successful, right? Taking that risk, having the emotional agility and awareness to face anxiety, face fear, face a challenge and nervousness, and take the leap anyway. And if we're successful, it tends to predict that later on, we're going to have higher efficacy, right? More confidence in our ability to do that thing again. What some of the other predictors are things like vicarious success. So you mentioned kind of the famous quote earlier, right? We're the average of the 5 people we surround ourselves with. Oftentimes what you'll notice is that you might become more and more confident in your ability to have a big dream and actualize that dream, take on a big goal, accomplish a significant task, if you are surrounded by people who are doing those things as well, because seeing that shift our belief, can shift our mindset. Vicarious success.
Validation, sort of.
Well, I think just the awareness that it is possible, and not just possible in an abstract sense, but it really concretizes, okay, this person did that. Maybe it's possible for me too. We become a little bit more optimistic. We're a little more likely to take the leap, right? And the other piece is verbal persuasion. So I think this could happen in a couple ways. It goes back to what I talked about before with the people that surround you sort of, appropriately and realistically encourage you to take those steps, take on your goals, accomplish your dreams, whatever it might be. And I think a key word here is realistically. Because if I pull back to optimism, right? Optimism and pessimism are important. Like, you've got to be optimistic to have a go. Pessimism doesn't really guarantee you anything, but it can keep you safe, right? It can promote a certain healthy level of doubt that prompts action. You don't want unrealistic optimism, right? This, what we would call in the States, a friend of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, director of resilience training, Dr. Karen Rivett, she calls Pollyannaism, a reference to an old American actress who is just sort of bubbly and happy-go-lucky and everything's good all the time. You don't necessarily want that, because that's the belief that things will go well regardless of what we do. This sort of idea of manifesting, which I'm not particularly a fan of. What you want is actually a little bit of that doubt that prompts you into action, that prompts you to take steps and execute behaviors that actualize outcomes, right? So back to the verbal persuasion, you want to surround yourselves with people who, sure, they support you, they push you, they promote the possibility of your success, but they're also not just blowing smoke at you. Yeah, you'll do it. You don't really have to try. It's just going to happen. Sometimes they provide that dose of reality. And this is why people like coaches as well, or having a coaching relationship, because that person can oftentimes be that mirror and show them some of that that reality while still being supportive
Right.
and still boosting optimism. So if you break down those three things, right? Previous success that leads to greater confidence, verbal persuasion that leads to greater confidence, and vicarious success that leads to greater confidence. Two of those three we actually get from other people. So even though these are internal beliefs, right? A lot of self-talk and inner dialogue, they can be tremendously impacted by the people we engage in and just the people that we surround ourselves with, like through this sort of contagiousness, so to speak, right?
Right. Yeah. Am I still there with you, Nick? Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, you had asked about mindsets. I mean, that's like kind of the fundamental, I think, component there, the optimism, pessimism. How do you surround yourselves with people that help promote that optimism and confidence? Now, if you want to bridge that to the other piece, which is skill acquisition,
Right.
well, in order to acquire a skill, I mentioned it earlier, you've got to actually take action. Whether you're successful, whether you fail, it ultimately comes down to having a go, right? Practicing, learning, experiencing time and time again, sort of repetitiously. And so the mindset piece is fundamental to that.
Yeah, I love that, because essentially we're pointing out, it's not, especially that you pointed out the process of manifestation and how you're not a fan of it, because it kind of brushes out the work and the action that a person does, and I just manifested. It's not like that. You put some real work, you take some reps, and that is how it's done. And this is more sort of scientific backing and a more detailed explanation, which Nick just gave us. And I loved how you sort of broke that down, and now I think it's much more understandable for the people from the outside. And when they get your book and they read it, they'll get a better idea about it. Nick, one thing that I've constantly had an experience to deal with, or rather seen in Indian community, is the fact that we struggle with herd mentality. If there's one success story, people sort of just go for that. It's more sort of like a sheep mentality. You'll go for that. No, this is the next thing. Or on parents' ends, if there's a success story, if I'll take my example. If my family, I'm an actor, I'm an entertainer. Everybody else in my family, they're more sort of on the MBAs and marketing guys, and all these management and marketing people. For me, my parents wanted me to be another MBA guy, right? But I did not want that for myself, right? So I just want you to sort of shine light as to how would you recommend that we break through that pattern that I think is being driven from the colonial past that we had back when 1800s Britishers came and they colonized India, and that's where the real jobs started up, right? And that's where we sort of got into it. How can one have a better relationship with fear? Because what we're really talking about is the uncertainty here. You see a success story and you get this idea like, okay, this is stable. Let's have our kid get into this and he's going to have a stable life. But what can we do on a personal level to sort of have a better relationship with the fear in order to be highly resilient from the foundational years?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't, and I'm not suggesting that you're suggesting this. I wouldn't necessarily say that always going against, as you put it, the herd mentality is the right thing to do, right? There's plenty to extend the metaphor, there's plenty of instances where being with the herd is actually a very protective factor.
Right.
I think what you're bringing up is sort of this tension between communalism and individualism, right? And the extent to which you belong to this, whatever it might be, familial group, organization, interest group, nation state, religious group, whatever it might be, while also maintaining a certain level of sense of self and authenticity, which gets overused a lot. And I know that there's certain scientific pushback against this idea of authenticity, but I think ultimately what you're sort of tapping into is what we would call coherence, which is really like, am I existing and living day to day and behaving in a way that's in line with who I sort of want to be or envision myself to be, right? And this has some interesting, I think, cultural components. A lot of the research that I'm familiar with, especially in the world of positive psychology, is primarily conducted in the United States, or at least the Western world. And that tends to mean that the samples in these studies are what we would call, quote unquote, weird samples, the acronym WEIRD. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed nations, right?
Right.
So they're going to have a certain cultural, I think, bias, in many cases, a cultural slant that we have to be acutely aware of here. So for instance, as somebody who's born and raised in the Midwest of the United States, and is of Polish heritage and German heritage and English heritage and things of that nature, my sort of cultural leanings in terms of individualism are quite different than, say, my wife's, who is the daughter of 2 Vietnamese refugees, right? And so you've got this interesting Eastern-Western sort of dynamic there. And I think she's probably, hopefully she doesn't mind speaking for her, at times in her life has struggled with the same things you mentioned, right? Doctor, lawyer, entrepreneur, dentist, whatever it might be. And she took a different route. So, how do your exact question was, when you're in that situation and you're dealing with those potential tensions, you want to belong, but you also are feeling incoherent, right? You're not necessarily living in the way that makes sense to you or that you want to be living. How do you deal with the tension, the fear, the anxiety, the nervousness, the sadness, the depression that comes with that?
Right.
This is not necessarily, let me give a disclaimer here. I'm not speaking to this necessarily from a research perspective, right? I'm going to kind of speculate here and tie some things together. Emotions tend to be signals, right? Now, they're not always accurate, right? This is sort of the foundation, I think, of cognitive behavioral skills, and cognitive behavioral therapy is sometimes what we think will generate an emotional response, and what we think can be incorrect, right? Objectively and factually, time to time.
Right.
That said, let's assume that emotions are accurate. Emotions tend to be signals. So when you're facing the fear of potentially, losing a family member or losing the approval of family, got to say, okay, that is a realistic possibility. But that tends to exist simultaneous to the fear or the anxiety of not taking the leap, of not knowing, of not doing the thing, whatever it might be, right? And sometimes you've got to sit down and kind of do, I think, a pretty simple cost-benefit analysis and kind of say, what are the trade-offs of potentially losing this relationship, losing this affection or this approval or this respect of this, member of my family or my tribe, right? Whatever it might be, versus living a life that is for somebody else and not for myself, right? That doesn't allow me to ever really pursue my interests and potentially explore all the things that life has to offer and become all the things that I might want to be or that I'm capable of being. And I think just dealing with the reality of that unpleasant emotion and trying to understand it logically, think through it, and then make conscious, intentional decisions rather than just getting wrapped up in the emotion of it all is a pretty good first step to take. Does that make it easy? No, of course not. That's the unfortunate thing about unpleasant affect, unpleasant emotion, right?
Right.
So that might be baby steps. It doesn't necessarily mean, in your case, if your parents want you to be an MBA or something like that, it doesn't necessarily mean, now maybe you did this anyway, you can tell me and your listeners, but that you just say, well, screw it, I'm out of here, Los Angeles, here I come, Hollywood, here I come, and let's just have a go, right? You might have, done a little performing in India first. You might have sort of dug into screenwriting and acting as a field and look at some of the stats and the percentages and sort of educate yourself on it. You may have started to dip your toe in the water. You didn't just necessarily do a cannonball, right?
Right.
So I think being thoughtful and strategic about it is a really important piece, because you're right, that you are running risks and potentially, disrupting relationships that can be really meaningful.
Right.
Now, that's also, an American might look at that very differently and say, well, screw it. Like if my, parents don't support me in doing this thing, then that's on them. That's a little different, I think, on the culture that you're talking about and the different emphases on family ties and community, that nature.
Right. Definitely. Being a culturally tight and keeping the traditional values really high, being raised up in that society, certain things are way on a different end of the spectrum than they would be in America or any other part of the Western world. Cultural beliefs and values, they count for big decisions here. And I love what you said, not to get wrapped up in the instant of your emotions. Just take a step back, sit with it, address all the outcomes that you might be thinking of, that might come to your mind, and then take a more informative decision on it.
Yeah. That's emotional intelligence and emotional agility, right? It's being able to step back, get outside of yourself, see the emotions for what they are without judgment necessarily, and make sense of them, and then act and respond in a relatively thoughtful way.
Right. I think not only is it a great way to sort of address what's going on in your head, it also this new culture where drugs and alcohol is promoted in millennials and Gen Zs. I think it gives them a good tool to sort of not to get wrapped up in their thoughts and in their feelings. It just gives them a tool to sit back and really evaluate what's going on, and they can stay away from
it. That's an important point. You don't want to try to just numb it and run away from it, because it's not going anywhere. And we've got lots and lots of good research that suggests when you try to just simply suppress or avoid unpleasant emotion, what you tend to do is actually just magnify it. You just compound it and make it worse, right? And so what this means in this particular scenario is, if you're experiencing that fear, that anxiety about not taking the leap, right? Or about potentially disrupting a relationship, well, I just said there's some action steps you can take to dip your toe in the water a little bit and kind of say, like, is this right for me, and deal with that. But there's also some action steps, ideally, that you can take depending on the quality of the relationship with your parents, with whoever it might be, and kind of say, like, listen, mom, dad, whoever it might be, this makes me feel unpleasant. Right? Like, I would like to explore these things, and I'm feeling this pressure as if our relationship depends on me pursuing these things, right? That doesn't feel supportive. That doesn't feel loving. Maybe it's, I know you want what's best for me. I know you want me to be financially stable and succeed, but I need to know, like, is it about just my safety and my stability, and I know this is a dynamic in some communities, or is it about what your friends think of me, right? And what I do and how much money I make and those sorts of things. And so you might respond to the unpleasantness by taking action and communicating that to the parties involved as well, right? But either way, you're taking action in one or both directions. You're not just saying, I'm going to suppress and push this away by getting drunk, getting high, whatever it might be, right? You're trying to process and respond to the emotions, not just eliminate them.